Russia, Russia, Russia.
PsyOps.
A lot of Russia. It's Wednesday today, so we're going to do Russia.
Yes.
Of course.
Canary Cry does Russia.
Does Russia. All right, we're going to start off. There's a bunch of stories that we outlined in the show notes and the description there. And
can't cover all of them.
Can't cover all of it, but there are various topics. I was going to subtitle this Russia's Gordian Knot. You know, there's just this idea that it's so intertwined that it can't be undone. But no, we didn't go with that because we're going to choose our topics. But the first one has to do with this lady named Dugina. How do you say it?
I think Dugina, but
well, let's find out.
No.
Wow, Sonic Boom.
Dugina. Wow, look at that. Somebody sent in a jingle before we even covered the story.
It's Jonathan F. Yeah, I'll be thanking him later.
Thank you, Jonathan F. That is what we're talking about. You see a story coming down the pipeline, just create a jingle for it ahead of time.
Yep.
That's great.
Yeah, so this is a Telegraph. Right. The headline here is Russians vow to strike Ukraine after daughter of Vladimir Putin's ally dies in car bomb. And the photos at the top are so disturbing. There's a flame with the car, so it's horrible looking. And then a guy sort of flabbergasted, his hands on his head, sort of, just disturbed at the whole thing. Here's what it says.
Right.
We won't read the whole thing, but Kremlin-linked officials have vowed to strike Ukraine as Russia blamed Kyiv for a car bomb attack in Moscow that killed a prominent pro-war ideologue. The first attack in the Russian capital since the start of the war. Ukrainian officials denied they had any links to the murder of Daria Durgina, but have still warned...
Dugina.
It says Durgina with an R in this.
Is there an R in there?
I don't know. Maybe there's a Western thing there. But have still warned of increased Russian attacks around Ukraine's Independence Day on August 24th. That's today, which also marks 6 months since the start of the war. That's so convenient.
Oh, yeah. It's Ukrainian Independence Day.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, let's honor it.
Ukraine, new world order.
There you go.
Bust
Ukraine.
out the hot dogs. Go to you bust out the barbecue, the Budweiser, the fireworks, the firecrackers,
the blue and yellow streaks.
Get your AR-15s. Do they celebrate their Independence Day the same way we do?
That would be funny.
You think?
That'd be funny. Yeah. Zuckerberg on a wakeboard.
Head out to the lake.
Got some ideas.
Go tubing down the river. All very insensitive things to say, considering the country is a war-torn hellscape right now. So that was an example of what an insensitive bad person would say.
Yes.
Whereas I say, you are strong and important, Ukrainians, and keep on keeping on.
Yeah. All right. Quote, we should be aware that this week Russia may try to do something particularly nasty, something particularly cruel. Such is our enemy, end quote, Vladimir Zelensky, Ukraine's president, said in his regular video address. Ukraine's Southern Military Command said it had seen several new Russian missile-carrying warships arrive in the Black Sea in the past week. The city authorities in Kharkiv, North Ukraine, also ordered a 36-hour curfew. And then there's a photo here of Daria Dugina. It is Dugina. They just misspelled it. Come on, Guardian.
Come on.
Miss Dugina was killed as she drove back to central Moscow in a Toyota Land Cruiser from a literary and arts festival on the outskirts of the city, where her father, the prominent ultra-nationalist philosopher Alexander Dugin, had been speaking. It is likely that... let me just finish this. It is likely that Mr. Dugin, who has been called Putin's brain and has been close to the Kremlin, was the intended target. He was supposed to drive into Moscow with his daughter, but decided at the last minute to travel back in another car. A video shot immediately after the bomb had exploded showed Mr. Dugin holding his hands to his head in shock as he stares at the burning wreck. Rubble is strewn across the road. Miss Dugina was 29, had died immediately from an explosive device, which had been placed under the bottom of the car on the driver's side. I mean, that is tragic. And just telling someone with children, this is just terrifying.
Yeah, no matter what, it's tragic to be a father and watch your daughter die in a fiery car bomb in front of you. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the Guardian there. And it goes on and talks about Putin's brain.
So this Putin's brain guy is pretty interesting. And we'll get more into him in a second. I want to jump over this NPR article.
Yeah.
And kind of give the vibe from over there, because it's a little bit different. It's interesting.
They spelled Daria different too. In this headline, it's DARIA. And the last article, it was DARYA.
You know, it's interesting. It is occurring to me that they have an entirely different alphabet over there.
Oh, true.
So I could see, they're trying to translate it in different. There's so many layers of translation here.
Yeah, Babel really messed everything up, huh?
So as far as even trying to spell a phonetic version of a name, you got to kind of wing it.
Yeah.
All right, NPR.org. The headline: Daria Dugina's assassination could spell trouble for Putin's allies in Russia. Earlier this gives an interesting, angle, which feels a little bit more propagandistic, but there's some more details. Earlier this week in Russia, there was a televised funeral for Daria Dugina, just days after she was killed in a car bombing in Moscow. Dugina was a Russian propagandist.
Oh.
So she was a journalist, I think is what we would call her. She was a Russian journalist. But NPR is saying Dugina was a Russian propagandist, which says a lot, because you might be tempted to, try to differentiate between those two things. But I think essentially what we're seeing here is the media kind of admitting that it's the same thing.
Yeah,
Dugina was a Russian propagandist.
Yeah, so spitting propaganda NPR by calling her the propagandist. It's its own propaganda. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the difference between a journalist and a propagandist is a journalist reports facts and a propagandist tries to convince you of something.
Right.
And so
which NPR is doing.
A journalist, which NPR routinely does, and lots of journalists routinely do.
Yeah.
And I think this is a nice, simple example of how even we, as just people who are consuming the media, can differentiate between a propagandist and a journalist. If you're getting straight facts, it's a journalist. If it seems like they're trying to sway you or convince you of something, that's a propagandist.
Yep.
Dugina was a Russian propagandist who supported her country's invasion of Ukraine, both on TV and online. Her death made global headlines, both for its violence and because of the political prominence of her father, Alexander Dugin. It also signaled, and this is a big one, it also signaled that Moscow's elite may not be safe in their own city, said Marlene Laruelle, the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University.
Is that a threat?
Nice. It's a nice CIA person here.
Threat from
it kind of sounds like a threat, doesn't it?
Of an institution. Okay, all right.
Mm-hmm. Quote, the war is progressively coming to them in the Russian territory, she said. Quote, the message the killing is sending, even if we cannot interpret exactly who did that and who the actual target was, is that if you can have a terrorist act in Moscow in the middle of the war, it means elites are suddenly not feeling secure anymore. And then it moves into, it was an interview style thing, but I think it's good for us to know who this Dugina guy is. So here's just a quick little rundown. On Alexander Dugin's origins. So this is the father of the propagandist. He was pretty famous in the 90s because he was one of the first ones in Russia to formulate a kind of political language of Russia's great power and empire. But in the 2000s, he really lost some of his prominence, and there are many other ideologies who appeared who are much more influential on the regime's kind of strategy. He has been pretty marginalized inside Russia. He's more famous abroad than in Russia itself. He has had very anti-Ukrainian ideology since the beginning, which is some of his most famous work in the mid-90s. He was saying that Ukraine doesn't exist as a state, as a nation, that it's a construction of the West as a kind of anti-Russian strategy. And that's something that was not so common at that time. But after that, he really has been working on many other countries, creating a big geopolitical vision for Russia as an empire. And he has always been very anti-Ukrainian, to the point that Ukraine has forbidden him from entering Ukrainian territory already for about 15 years. In the mid-2000s, he was already persona non grata in Ukraine. So this guy, pretty famous guy, apparently. He's an academic, he's a philosopher, but you can almost think of him like a Salman Rushdie or a Noam Chomsky, almost. Although Noam had some actual political power at one point, but he's a thinker, he's a philosopher, he's a this, he's a that type of thing. Now in Russia, as we know, not even just in Russia, around the world, these philosophers, political thinkers, people like this, they're often wrapped up in the same sort of shenanigans that the actual politicians are, as far as corruption, things like this. So it's interesting. We just had the Salman Rushdie attack where he was stabbed on stage, attacked for a book he wrote in 1988 or something. Yeah. And you can kind of think of this Dugin fella as the same type of archetype. I'm not comparing them per se, but I'm just saying he's that's what he is. He's one of these inflammatory authors or whatever. And so we saw the Salman Rushdie stabbing, and now we see this car bomb that took out his daughter. Now, does the skeptic in me wonder if this is also a Putin job? Was this designed as justification for further retaliation on the Ukraine? I mean, the whole... That's
what I'm saying, man. It's a Gordian knot. There's multiple narratives.
I know.
Any story coming out about Russia.
We're both coming back from an art show. I'm just going to randomly go in a different car. No, you stay in that car. I will go in this car. It's the sort of dark, villainous sort of plot that you can, you could write in a movie about how the villain sacrifices his own child for the furthering of blah, 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 blah. But it's just, I was probably more stimulated by this story intellectually, as far as the propaganda and how this, the stories about how the war is going are interesting. And I read plenty of those as far as like the battlefield stuff. But when it comes to why a war is happening and what keeps war happening, it's not so much the battlefield stuff. It's this narrative building stuff. So I thought it was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it goes on to kind of equate Dugin's popularity with contemporary far-right thinking and how he pushed for a new empire of conservative values against the so-called decadent West and liberal culture and whatnot. So your typical... Which is a big part of how Putin is presented to us. Yes. Is as sort of like a far-right traditionalist type of guy. So I thought it was interesting there saying he's like, oh, this Dugin fella, he's not that influential anymore. But it's like, okay, but apparently what he did exactly in the 90s, like all the right-wing Republicans in America.
Right.
Like, okay.
Yeah. So what do you think? Anything?
Nothing much else. I mean, we could speculate on all the different angles, but I don't think that's necessarily fruitful. I think we've covered what we need to on this because it truly is sort of the propaganda and how, for example, NPR would call Daria Dugina a propagandist and things of that nature. So peddling its own propaganda. So,
just real quick, the ending of this NPR article goes like this. I think her death will be used by the conservative reactionary groups to kind of create a martyr out of her. Of course. She was a young, good-looking woman. So that will help create the myth of her martyrdom. Again, we're talking about the modern myth creation. Yeah. This is how you control people. I think her death will be used globally, not only by the conservative circles, but also by the regime for some kind of domestic repression. Yeah, terrorism does that. Another hint that maybe it is some sort of Russian plot. I don't know. But, you think about governments using terrorism as an excuse for oppression. Much like some other very familiar governments in our lives. You have NBR saying, they're going to use this to take away our freedoms. The regime will have to showcase that it can answer to a terrorist act, and that will probably mean higher repression. Yes, indeed. Now, here's the reason why I think NPR called her a propagandist and not a journalist. Because if it was a journalist killed in a terrorist attack, hello, Jamal Khashoggi, and the Israeli woman, or Palestinian reporter who got killed in a little thing. Over and over and over, journalists getting killed is used as like a pro-freedom, anti-war, anti-government, etc., talking point, propaganda, if you will. But you have this woman, a journalist, being killed by terrorists on the streets of Moscow. If you call her a journalist, you have to protect her. You have to defend her.
Right. They don't want to do that.
Defend her family.
They want to smear her as far right.
They don't want to be trapped in their little box that they created, by the way.
Yeah.
The media created their own little prison where if a journalist gets killed, it has to be, made into some anti-war message.
A martyr.
Exactly, a martyr.
Yeah.
And so, they call her a propagandist so they don't have to defend a Russian because God forbid you defend a Russian journalist.
Yeah.
So they call her a propagandist, which, is very similar to the strategy that they've used for really any right-leaning conservative journalist in America as well.
Yeah.